Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Albert Chiu. Former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger died recently, aged 100. In the months leading up to his death, during a trip to China, he persistently highlighted the negative aspects of a confrontation between the U.S. and China. His support for China's authoritarian regime has made him a somewhat contentious character. What are the implications of his death? Joining us today are William Vocke, Board Treasurer, Fulbright Association of Alumni, and Liou To-hai, National Chengchi University Adjunct Professor of Diplomacy. A very warm welcome to both on the show. Okay. Henry Kissinger, known as the father of American diplomacy, was called Super Secretary of State in American history by former U.S. President Ford. He's also referred to as an old friend of China. In 1972, his secret diplomacy facilitated President Nixon's visit to China, and in a 25-year ice-breaking journey between the U.S. and China. This led to the establishment of diplomatic relations between them in 1979 and the severance of ties with Taiwan. This was instrumental in forming a strategic anti-Soviet alliance between the U.S. and China during the Cold War. So my first question goes to William. How should the death of Henry Kissinger be interpreted as marking the end of an era of secret diplomacy and power politics? And what's your perspective on this?
Secret diplomacy and power politics are a normal part of international relations, and this will not mark the end of an era in that sense. But Kissinger was known for being super secret, for being very manipulative, and for engaging in diplomacy and then announcing major breakthroughs, like from his perspective, the opening to China. So no, I don't think that this marks an end. His impact on the United States in the post-Cold War era was immense. He and perhaps Dean Acheson are the two great secretaries of state in the post-Cold War era, and we can talk more about the things that Kissinger based his foreign policy on.
To-hai, I also wonder what's the impact that Kissinger had on the United States in the post-Cold War era?
I believe, Henry Kissinger is what's so-called the realist guru. So in that case, he always prioritized the big power relationship because he believed big powers shaped the international environment, while small and medium power have no choice but to accommodate this changing international environment. For example, we just mentioned about his secret diplomacy to China that had brought about inter-Korea dialogue, as well as the Japanese independent foreign policy. Tanaka decided to establish formal diplomatic relations with China right away in 1972. So in that case, when it comes to the post-Cold War era, I think so far U.S. has conducted a sort of the coordinated diplomacy, in particular under this administration. That means no more this kind of secret diplomacy. There's still something there. That means U.S. has continued to prevent the big power confrontation. You can easily find out President Biden said, yes, our relationship with China is competitive, or competition, but not confrontation. So he still emphasized the communication, but rather than secret diplomacy.
William, you just mentioned that the secret diplomacy is a norm in international relations. But we all know, since we are in the show, we're talking about the U.S. China relations, even the cross-strait relation between Taiwan and China. So what's your judgment about Kissinger's achievements, or maybe problem with kind of breaking the ice with then Chairman Mao, and also opened up a new era for the United States? So what's your judgment about this?
In terms of the secret diplomacy, we know that, for instance, the meeting with Biden and Xi Jinping, there was 3-4 hours of conversation. We don't have access to that. We don't know what was happened, exactly what was talked, if there were any agreements that were coming to, and that's the essence of diplomacy. And that kind of secrecy will continue. That's something that needs to happen before announcements can be made about arrangements for treaties, arrangements for activities. In terms of the last part of your question, The impact of a realpolitik approach, which is, as the professor suggested, was at the heart of Kissinger's diplomacy. That focus on the major powers is something that is becoming more and more important in the upcoming years. China and the United States are playing a role that some people have said is similar to the world before 1910, or perhaps the world before 1940, perhaps the world before 1790. In which major powers play a significant role,
right.
and the other smaller powers have difficulty. I think the real problem with Kissinger's diplomacy, it tended to disregard humanitarian issues.
Okay.
It tended to disregard small powers' interests in the world.
Yeah. Okay. Well, a follow-up from me is that the Kissinger approach towards China sometimes is seen as a factor that enabled the rise of China's assertive wolf warrior diplomacy. We know that the human rights issue, as you just mentioned, that Henry Kissinger throughout his career does not really pay a lot of attention to. But does that mean that Kissinger's breakthrough or his kind of achievements in setting up a relationship with China kind of help China to work in that direction that's still against the human rights?
What Kissinger did was he created a triangular relationship between the Soviet Union, China, and the United States. And of course, without that and without the opening to China, there may then not have been an opening economically for China. Okay. So of course it's behind all of that. Whether it directly led to a wolf warrior perspective in China, I think that's questionable. I think that comes more from China's place in the world and from how China feels about the century of humiliation.
Well, what about you, To-hai? Do you think that Kissinger's approach towards China is really a factor or reason for this rise in China in that assertive way that might be threatening to the world?
I'm a kind of just similar to Professor Vocke, because Kissinger detanged the relationship with China. That brought about chances for China to rise, of course. And Deng Xiaoping actually later, instructed the Chinese leaders to take a low profile, to nurture their power. But later, when China became economically stronger and stronger, they decided to abandon Deng Xiaoping's instruction. That's why they moved toward this kind of warrior behavior.
Okay, let's now kind of shift the gear a bit by talking about the issue of Taiwan. Before Kissinger's death, he actually said the issue of Taiwan had no solution. Given that the U.S. China consensus still does not support Taiwanese independence, so how should Taiwan's situation be interpreted in the context of the long-term competitive relationship between the U.S. and China? Maybe William, you can answer this one?
Well, as I said before, what Kissinger did was open up a relationship between the United States and China, primarily because of the Soviet Union. It was seen as a card in the relationship with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, today Russia, the Soviet Union is no more. There are 15 republics where there was once one country. And that means that the relationship now between superpowers is really basically China and the United States. And in that context, from a Kissinger's perspective, Taiwan was not relevant. For instance, Taiwan's democracy was not a relevant issue. Kissinger is famously noted as saying on multiple occasions that if he had to choose between justice and order, he would choose order. And it suggests that his passing is unlikely to have any significant long-term impact on the China-Taiwan-American triangle.
So also I'm curious, what do you mean by have no long-term impact on the triangle? Do you mean that now it's a totally brand new era for the triangle relationship to go on or to continue without any kind of secret diplomacy or behind a smoke filled room, that type of interaction among elites? For the last 20 years, 30 years, Kissinger has operated next to American diplomacy. He's operated as a private citizen who was consulted on a regular basis by leadership. So Kissinger's leaving, basically dying, basically takes away one person who can act as an interlocutor, act as a mediator, or an individual who can go between the two countries. But there are many other people that can do that. And
it's not the end of an era, it's the end of Henry Kissinger.
Okay. What about you, To-hai? Would you say that when Kissinger said that the issue of Taiwan had no solution, does he mean that there's no way out for Taiwan's autonomy in the future, or what's your take on this?
That's an American perspective. Big powers, they're only concerned about their own national security, national interest. That's inevitable. If Taiwan were a big power, perhaps we would play the same way. That's how they manage their relationship with another big power. That means avoid confrontation, because China viewed Taiwan as its vital interest. If U.S. also viewed Taiwan as a vital interest, and then military confrontation could be inevitable. So that is why President Biden also mentioned about that. No military confrontation, communication is a must.
Okay. The next question is the upcoming presidential election, where Kissinger's death continue to affect the, among the U.S. and China and Taiwan. So if Trump influence resurges, which is very likely, according to several polls, what potential impact could this have, William?
Well, a Trump presidency a second Trump presidency would have a dramatic impact on American foreign policy, and I think it's independent of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was consulted by Trump. Basically, he had a very low opinion of Trump's view of international affairs. Kissinger believed that international politics, and it really comes from his history, from having to leave Germany in 1938 by working in the American military as an interpreter and analyst in World War II, by his first book, which was his dissertation, which was called A World Restored. It was about the Council of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars and the way Metternich and Castlereagh, Austria, Hungary, and Britain, the way these men manipulated international relations and created an era of relative peace. And he saw that as his job. His job was not to promote values. It was not to promote a world in which we were trying to build something globally. It was keeping America safe, because he was also focused on nuclear weapons. I think the one thing to remember about Kissinger is he was shaped by the Cold War. And the lesson we can learn from Kissinger for the time ahead is how the Cold War was fought. The things that were done right and the things that were done wrong, and whether or not any of those apply to the relationship between the United States and China.
Right. Let's take the question deeper, or one step further, is that when you mention Donald Trump, his effect is independence of Kissinger's effect. There might be one thing in common, is the isolationist attitudes. Trump obviously is an isolationist, supporter that American first, put the priority on the national interest of the United States. Some might argue that it's okay for him to sacrifice small countries' national interests like Taiwan. But others would say that, because Trump is so anti-China, so that kind of opened up a room for the development of Taiwan, especially regarding its autonomy. When it comes to Kissinger might be, isolationist in a different way, that like what I mentioned, that he want to make sure that the peace and also the stability of the U.S. countries is guaranteed. So, how could you kind of, use the isolationism, especially in the American version, to kind of explain the two figures? Do you see any commonality between the two politicians?
Actually, not a lot. Trump's isolationism is more a nationalism. It's a nationalism which says America first. That's the MAGA movement's credo. Kissinger's disregard for smaller states in the world and human rights issues was more based upon an understanding of global geopolitics. And as the professor said, he was the ultimate realist. He thought that power was the one thing that was important in international relations, and for him it was the power of the United States to remain free from major conflict, to prevent another major global war. You have to remember the time. It was the Soviet Union, it was the Cold War, there were nuclear weapons. That one of his other major books is Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. He was really concerned with how do we prevent a world in which the major powers are right at a trigger's end for the future.
Okay, so To-hai, what about you? Do you think that if Donald Trump ever get elected next year, do you think he's going to adopt the strategy often used by Henry Kissinger before?
I don't think so, because already in his first term, Henry Kissinger did not have any big impact on his foreign policy at all. So is the current Biden administration. And Biden said, when Henry passed away, and he said, I knew Henry very well, from time to time, we had totally different opinions. So in that case, actually, Henry Kissinger, his influence has already marginalized before he passed away. But in the future, under Donald Trump, U.S. will further focus on its own national interest exclusively. That's why he said American first, not only to get the support from the American people, but also try to show U.S. is true superpower. So in that case, he will continue manage U.S. relationship with China under U.S. leadership.
Do you want to jump in?
No, I agree completely with what has just been said.
Okay, I'm not trying to pick up on your answer, but I'm also curious about, are there any political figures nowadays in the U.S. politics or at the world stage, looks like Henry Kissinger's, according to observation, that kind of doing shadow diplomacy or secret diplomacy back and forth and try to gain some personal interest instead of national interest or things like that? William?
There are a number of people around who from an American perspective, play some of that role. John Kerry is the current American special envoy for climate and flies the world negotiating with leaders around the world and has been Secretary of State and was a senator. He's a major figure, but Kissinger is almost unique. Former President Bill Clinton and his wife, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, have a similar kind of global reach and a global brand. But few have combined it with what you rightfully mentioned was the private side. Kissinger had Kissinger Associates and made tons of money consulting with people all over the world. So there are a few that do it in that public-private way. The Clintons have a foundation, but it's a nonprofit foundation. So I can't think of anybody actually in the last 50 years who had quite the stature and access that that Henry Kissinger had.
Okay, Dela, what about you? Anyone off the top of your head, like Henry Kissinger?
Yeah, I don't think so, because that's unusual situation. It's not easy to have anybody like Kissinger in the future because he's so influential, predominant. Current U.S. government is kind of a diplomatic teamwork under Jack Sullivan and Yellen, Janet Yellen.
Okay, well, it's actually unfair to view Kissinger in an entirely negative light. After all, he advised 12 U.S. presidents, as you mentioned, William mentioned in the past, including Donald Trump himself, even though Kissinger does not really have a high opinion of Donald Trump. He was known for his shadow diplomacy, an approach he used in attempts to negotiate a truce during the Vietnam War, though it was not entirely successful. He also sought peaceful solutions for conflicts in the Middle East. So the next question goes to William. So if Kissinger's death signifies the end of effective communication between the CCP and the U.S., does this suggest that a U.S.-China confrontation is likely to escalate in the future?
A U.S.-China confrontation may escalate, but it's probably not relevant that Kissinger won't be there. There would be other channels for communication and other ways for the two sides to signal to each other whether they are interested in a more cooperative relationship. You're right, Kissinger did have some very positive things that he did. Perhaps one of the best known is détente, the SALT treaties. And as I said, people forget, and most of your viewers probably don't remember how terribly tense the Cold War was, but I remember as a boy getting under desks in the high school because of a possible atomic bomb attack. And that was Kissinger's concern. Kissinger's concern was at that level, major global conflict between the great powers. And he was successful in helping moderate that. But he was in part responsible for deaths in Bangladesh, in East Timor, in Chile, and it's hard to weigh the positive and the negative with Kissinger because there is so much.
Right. I mean, he also signed a agreement with the Soviet Union, trying to make a pacified or peaceful kind of status quo between the two great powers, so that the Soviet Union at that time was allowed some type of room for the political dissent in the domestic Soviet Union. So maybe that was unintentional achievements by him, but I think you're right that there are both sides. So what about you, To-hai? Do you think that Kissinger has any positive contribution to the world, even though we talk about how his influence of Taiwan on Taiwan is probably negative, but what others?
I agree with Professor Vocke. 1962 almost the Cuban Missile Crisis brought about a nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So all others, small and medium powers, they were so worried about that as well. So nowadays, only two big superpowers, United States and China. Of course, Russia is another big one. So still, I think balance of power will continue to serve as the golden principle for big powers to interact with China. So that is why the Biden administration has brought about India, another big one, to balance China's rise.
William just mentioned that there are other approaches or channels between U.S. and China, even without Kissinger, right? Could you can answer this as well. Could you kind of specify what might be those channels for the U.S. and China to talk to each other without diplomats, secrets like Henry Kissinger's?
The big difference between the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, that is the emergence of economic relationship. So like China, business leaders between the two sides, they tend to try to collaborate with each other or communicate with each other or try to affect their domestic leader as well as the rival leaders. Make sure they can make money. So that's also another way to avoid a war between the big powers.
What about you, William?
He's absolutely right. The level of American economic interest and Chinese economic interest is very high. I mean, the relationship between the two economically is almost impossible to untangle. And senior leaders in American business, Morgan Stanley, the automobile companies, battery companies, etc. They all have an interest in making sure that this relationship doesn't move to a conflictual basis. And there are lots of channels of those people. It will depend upon who's in power. Some of them have better access to Democrats, some of them have better access to Republicans. And then there's the whole range of former diplomats who have dealt for years with China. So I don't think there's any lack of channels between the two countries if the countries and the leadership are interested.
And also, do you think that these channels is likely to happen again? It's going to at the cost of Taiwan's benefits or Taiwan's national interest, like what Kissinger did in 1970s? Maybe William, you can answer this first.
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And there are people in America in senior positions in think tanks and in and out of government who would think that, like Kissinger did, that Taiwan's interests are not very important. But there's a whole series of other people who think that democracy, the role Taiwan plays in the semiconductor industry, etc., make Taiwan a really important partner for America. The question of whether America and Taiwan, America will continue to be supportive of Taiwan, I think we need to leave open. I don't want to prognosticate on that because I think it is an open question.
Okay, what about you, To-hai? You think the channel gonna be at the cost of Taiwan's interest?
I think it depends on domestic politics in both China and United States. I think Professor Vocke already mentioned about American part. Same thing in China. Not all Chinese wants to have a war with Taiwan, all right? Because they said they also want to enjoy, economic prosperity. Why have a war with Taiwan? Immediately, China will suffer the economic sanctions from the West. There's no need to do so. So that is why I think in the future, I think no matter China or United States or Taiwan, three sides should seek for a peaceful modus vivendi. That's the best way.
Okay, do you believe that the continuous U.S.-China dialogue serves the national interest of the U.S.? Or do you think that such ongoing dialogue is beneficial for the Taiwan security? They are like two-sided questions.
Yeah, I think so. Because, people all over the world have seen what happened in Ukraine war as well as the Israel-Hamas war. So many people suffer. Why do we need to seek for a war? So that is why dialogue, communication, it's a must for the post-Cold War era.
And to add to that, dialogue requires both parties wanting to dialogue. It requires both sides being interested in that, and we can kind of look at the recent history and see that at least in the short term, China has been less interested.
Thank you, To-hai, and also William, for the great insights. For many people in Taiwan, Kissinger's consistent pro-China stance has not been received well. However, it is undeniable that he has had a lasting impact on the world order. Our guest speakers analyze the likely developments in the past Kissinger era. Did you enjoy our show? Leave us a message and subscribe to Taiwan Talks. See you soon.